Perfect, starting. Well, welcome all to this Congress, the final Congress, the final event after the 3 roundtables about Kelsen. We have today speakers, keynotes, friends, from all over the world, from Australia and China to Brazil and Mexico. So thank you very much all, because we have several time differences today. In particular, many thanks to the team here with Juris North and my friends and colleagues, Gonzalo Rosas and Jorge Fabra Zamora, because we've been working on this project for about a year right now. I mean, people see the last roundtables and this Congress, but we started with this idea about a year ago. We'll be using 2 hashtags for social media if you want to use them as well. Hashtag Kelsen 2020 and Juris North 2021. The Congress will be slightly long today and tomorrow, so feel free to come and go, and we'll be recording all the sessions. Gonzalo Rosas is with us, and he will introduce himself later after I do a very brief introduction myself. And Dr. Jorge Luis Fabra Zamora will be joining us later from Toronto. Because of the time difference, he will chair the second block today. Very basic housekeeping rules. All Zoom attendees are entitled to chat with our keynotes and paper authors. The idea is to generate a dialogue. So please do not ask for permission, simply open the mic and fire your question. However, if you do want us to ask the question on your behalf, simply write the questions at the bottom. You should see a chat box. Simply write the question or comment, and we are more than happy to read those questions or comments on your behalf. Again, the platform, as I was explaining before we started recording the session, is on equal footing basis. So we are all entitled, to this kind of open dialogue. That's what we do at Juris North. The only limit, because we have a lot of Latin people, Latin American, Italian, Spanish, and so on, try to keep the comments in particular slightly short, not more than 2-3 minutes, because again, especially I'm from Latin America, we tend to overtalk, and our comment may end up being a mini monologue. So try to keep the comments slightly brief and the questions to the point. The idea is to give the opportunity to all of us to interact. If you want to remain anonymous, please feel free to. If you want to add your name and surname, please do it as well. Again, this is your platform. Because we have several jurisdictions, and I asked this permission by email when I send the program, I'm going to be recording. You will see my name here because of legal issues or legal reasons. However, you want to share our videos, which we'll share with you next week, please feel free to do it. I'll simply send me an email and you have my permission by default. But again, I do this, and we do this at Juris North when we go for online events, simply to avoid problems with different jurisdictions. You have by default my permission. If you want to take any picture or use any images, let me know. That's the only, because again, I will need to ask some other people for that. You will see 2 logos. I'm going to present very briefly both of them. One is Juris North, one is Fundação Angélica Goulart from Brazil. Juris North, as I was explaining earlier, I'm simply the face today. We have right now 9 institutions in the UK in 8 different locations. We are simply friends or colleagues from different institutions doing political theory, political philosophy, or legal theory, and decided to cut across institutions about 7 years ago. We were 5 people at the time. And then we started growing. We started with monthly discussions in our houses, whether Manchester, Birmingham at the time, Durham, Hull, and Liverpool. And we've been growing consistently. Right now, because of the pandemic, we decided to go online. We are right now from Aberdeen to Aberdeen in the north to Surrey in the south. And again, I'm simply the face today, but we are many people working on this. And luckily, this year, in addition to this Congress, we will carry on with the monthly discussions, 2 of them online, and the last one, if all goes well, at Newcastle School of Law, we will have Amalia Amaya presenting live face-to-face at Newcastle School of Law. And this is me and the foundation, Fundação Angélica Goulart. I'm from Latin America, from Argentina, and I'm not embarrassed to say all these events we do are for free, but I always ask for donations or sponsorship, because I represent, that's my way, I don't have children myself, so that's my way to pay back to Latin America for what they gave me. The idea is to bring Fundação Angélica Goulart, a foundation that has been working for teenagers and children in a very deprived area in Brazil for more than 30 years. And the idea, you can contact me or simply check on Facebook their page, and they explain to you in Portuguese, and you can translate with Google Translate in English or any other language, how to sponsor them. A pound is more than 5 Brazilian reals. And last year, and that's why I put the information, because of the pandemic, they were literally feeding people in Rio de Janeiro, 60 kilometers away from the city center. I don't usually put my names with charities because of money laundering and other issues. Again, we are lawyers or political scientists, we know how it works. However, I do put my name for this one because this foundation is very close to my heart. Why Brazil and not Argentina? Because first of all, I'm Latin American, and second, I'm Argentinian. So that's why I represent the foundation in Brazil and not in Argentina. I'm very proud about being Argentinian, but again, I'm first of all Latin American. Today, I'm going to introduce the 2 days, the first keynote speaker, the second and third authors, and I'll explain, we have today a casualty, and I'll explain why. And without further ado, we'll start with the discussion. Today, we'll have 3 presentations in block 1, or ideally 3 presentations, in reality 2. The whole event, the roundtables, and this Congress in particular are in memory of 3 people that have passed away a few years ago. The first one, the one lady who introduced me to Kelsen, Maria Teresa Lopez. She was part of, for those who are from Latin America, Carlos Cosio's group, Eugenio Buligin, Gibur, and many others. She was the unit leader of Introduction to Law and Philosophy of Law at the National University of La Plata, one of the top universities in Argentina. She passed away many years ago, and she was my mentor. The second one, I had the pleasure to meet him as well, Professor John Gardner, and if we are lucky, we'll have his wife as well today, Jennifer. She will join us at some point today and probably tomorrow. He brought Kelsen to the UK. Although we sometimes teach Kelsen in the UK for whatever reason, and I'm not trying to blame Hart here, Kelsen is not that popular. And I remember a bit more than 10 years ago, I went to a congress in Oxford, organized by many people, but in particular by John Gardner. And at the time, I think I was a PhD candidate, and he was very, I'm not trying to sound nice, he was very kind. I remember always kindness. So although he was a professor, a chair, and doctor, he noticed me. And I was with a friend of mine, many people know him, Dr. Jorge Portocarrero from Peru. And we were together, and John Gardner greeted us. So again, this is in memory of him who brought Kelsen more into the spotlight in the UK. And finally, very recently, we lost, although he's still with us, Professor Eugenio Buligin from Universidad de Buenos Aires, a top scholar, legal philosopher, maybe not as well known in the Anglo-American world. I think he deserves more credit, but certainly very well known in many places in the world, in particular Latin America, Spain, Italy, and Russia, because he was Argentinian/Russian or Ukrainian, some may claim. So again, this is in memory, a very humble, very modest memory from Gonzalo, Jorge, and myself to these 3 people. And now, Gonzalo, my dear friend and colleague, if you want to say something before I introduce Maris.
Yeah, I just want to remember that Professor Bernengo from University of Buenos Aires passed away 2 weeks ago, and he was a a tremendous translator. He translated the second edition of the Pure Theory of Law of Kelsen, and I want just to remember this famous guy. And I want to thank you, all of you, for being here today. I think that is a main effort for most of us to be here today, and I just want to thank you from my heart.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Yes, and I had the pleasure to meet Bernengo as well, because he was part of this same group, Lopez, Buligin, Cosio, and many others back from Argentina. So thank you, because again, people do know that Buenos Aires and La Plata are 50 kilometers away. So usually people teaching in Buenos Aires would have been teaching in La Plata or vice versa. So thank you very much, Gonzalo. Very sad news as well. Without further ado, again, we have the pleasure today to have Dr. Maris Köpcke from University of Barcelona, Spain, and University of Oxford, UK, obviously. So she will be our keynote speaker for the first block, and I will go back to Maris in a second. And we will have as well we were meant to have two presentations from Dr. Wei Feng from China University of Political Sciences and Law. Unfortunately, I got the news yesterday. Dr. Wei Feng had an accident. He's right now in hospital. I have to say he wanted to do his presentation via Zoom from hospital. We decided not to do it. So I want to say this because that speaks volumes about him. I've known him, I have for a while now online. I've never met him. And we work together. We've been collaborating for more than a year now. But again, all the best for Wei, and I'm hoping you don't need an operation. And we'll have as well Dr. Anna Taitslin, and I'll do the introduction later for Anna when we have her paper. Anna, thank you very much as well, because Anna is joining us from Canberra, Australia. So it's a pleasure to have you all. So after these presentations, and Maris, you will have a bit more time if you want to, and same Anna, because we can adapt since we don't have Wei today. We will have a short break, about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, depending on how the presentations go. So the idea, once again, is to have Maris' presentation for about 35, 40 minutes. Take as long as you want, because right now we have a bit more time. Then we'll open for questions and answers, about 20 minutes or so, maybe 30. And then we'll have Anna again, 35 minutes, roughly, not more than 40. And then we'll open for questions and answers, and we'll follow with a break. Maris, an absolute pleasure. I said this before. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Dr. Maris Köpcke Tinturé from University of Barcelona, Spain, and from University of Oxford, the UK. And she will introduce today Kelsen's place in the history of legal validity. I have to say, for the one that follow Maris, it's a pleasure to have you today. And I mean that, first of all, because I know the complications behind this presentation, but secondly, I have to say she's an expert. Check, please, not only her Oxford profile, but her own web page, because you will, it's true, don't be modest, Maris, but I've done it myself. But you can see her research, in particular about Kelsen, a top, I would say, because I've been studying Kelsen for, I look fine by 45. I've been studying Kelsen for more than 20 years. So I think one of the best pages dedicated to Kelsen right now. And it's fantastic to have such a scholar researching about him so seriously in English. So my guilty pleasure, Maris Köpcke. Thank you very much, Maris.
Well, thank you very much, Jorge, and obviously thank you, Gonzalo, and Jorge Luis Fabra, and everyone who is behind this very, very exciting, very large-scale, very tenacious and passionate project of Juris North, and in particular the workshop on Kelsen. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I first wish to add my good wishes for recovery to Professor Wei, and we will be missing you and we hope you get well soon. And may I also say that in relation to what Jorge said at the start, in terms of, speakers being experts versus everyone else being just human beings behind the veil of ignorance. So if there is such a dichotomy, I very much find myself in the second category, and especially so as regards to Kelsen. I mean, I love Kelsen, but I'm very, very far from, from someone who could be called an expert on Kelsen. And I think Jorge, in his very generous and kind introduction, has, I think, severely overstated the degree to which I can call myself someone who knows nearly enough of Kelsen. But I know that there are plenty of colleagues, including Jorge and many others, who are actually much better placed to be called that way. And they are all in, they have all been part of Juris North or will be part of this Kelsen Congress. And I look forward to learning from them in due course. Now, we are going to speak about Kelsen's place in the history of legal validity. That is my title. And that's the one thing I think I might contribute to you in you being a forum of Kelsen experts. Because, you all, or we all pretty much know what Kelsen says on validity. Yeah, we're not going to I'm not going to delve into this now, but I'm going to tell you his place in the history of validity. And chances are you may not know that much about this, because of course the history of validity can be traced back to something like 2000 years before Kelsen. And I think it is an interesting consideration to bear in mind when studying Kelsen, when interpreting him, to understand where he fits in that history. It's a fascinating history. It's been a long forgotten history. And I recently sort of tried to figure out, unearth it. And I found that there was so much to be learned from it. Now, what I'm gonna do in support of my presentation and also to, to clarify for everyone who's listening to me the various points in it, is I'm gonna share one picture. So I'm not going to have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to have a bullet point. I'm just going to have a picture. And I'm going to try to share it now through my screen, and that should work. Yeah, you see the picture? Yes, you do. Jorge puts his thumbs up. That means everything is in good order. Right. So that's a picture, and it's a very allegorical picture. I'm sorry that you see the sort of top part of the screen, which is this sort of this gray, but I know no way to take it out. Let me try to find a pointer through this. There we are. So, hang on a minute. I'm going to try to find a pointer so that I can actually point in the screen. Right, let's see. No, this is not a pointer. Sorry, I'm just trying to, this is for, okay. Right, I take it that you see now something like a red, yeah? Do you see a red dot moving around? Yeah, that's what Jorge indicates with this. So everything is in good order. Everything is in shape, we can start. Right, so here you've got the beautiful picture. Well, I call it beautiful because my mom has made the drawings. And so, I naturally find it very beautiful. And it is very allegorical. Yeah, this is a picture, by the way, that I've taken with kind permission from the editor from my short book. It's indicated here at the bottom, called A Short History of Legal Validity and Invalidity. A book appeared recently from a lovely publisher in the UK in Cambridge called Intersentia. It's a short booklet. And I use this picture at the start precisely to perform the function that I wanted to perform now, namely to give you a very broad overview of what that history of validity consists in. And I will be talking with you today through some aspects of it, obviously not through all of it, because we want to focus on Kelsen and we want to focus on what is relevant to Kelsen. But I need to give you a flavor of where all of this is coming from. Now, first of all, what do we mean when we say the history of validity? Yeah, what does that mean? Well, what I mean is the history of both the term and the concept of legal validity, right? So I say both the term and the concept because, as it happens, according to this research I did, the use of the word validity, and of course you would expect it, as you would expect, it was primarily in Latin, right? Validitas, valere, valid, etc. The use of the term accompanied, so the development, the gradual extension, the gradual increase in use of the term in Western legal thought, accompanied also the gradual use of the concept, right? So it was, they really went hand in hand. It could have been otherwise. It could have been that, we used the concept for a long time, but we just called it differently, and vice versa. But that wasn't the case. So the term and the concept of validity, of legal validity, were not always there. You won't be surprised to hear that. But they very gradually were forged as tools, really, by very creative legal thinkers in the last 2,000 years, roughly, in order to find solutions to new legal problems that appeared as the laws, legal systems developed. Now, we can't go into all the details, and we won't. But one thing I want to stress, which is that this term and this concept, meaning the term, the word legal validity and the idea of legal validity, they were consistently throughout this long history associated to a particular way of changing and creating legal duties and rights, right? So it's not only now, but also at the very, very inchoate beginnings of this idea that it was devised as something that we say about certain decisions, right? Which decisions have something in common, namely they change duties and rights. So for example, we can speak of a valid contract, right? A valid will, Romans would do that in some ways. A valid marriage, and of course a valid enactment. Nowadays, a valid administrative decision, a valid judicial pronouncement, right? So validity was consistently associated to a certain kind of action, a certain kind of human decision. I mean, nowadays, some doctrine would call it a declaration of will, right? So a way of expressing what the agent wants to do, be it a private agent making a contract with their friend, or be it a legislature, who is enacting a statute for the whole of the population of the state. Be that as it may, we're talking about certain ways of expressing one's will, which we call valid or invalid. When it's valid, in law, the result is that the rights and duties and powers, right, of some people are modified. That's true when you make a contract, when you make a marriage. That's true when a statute is enacted, when a judicial decision is issued. So that's common, and that is something like a red line that goes through this history of validity, and that indeed allows us to trace that history of validity. But now let's look at this graph, at this very allegorical graph, very allegorical picture. So if you look at the horizontal line on the bottom, you can see this is the temporal dimension. So you see it starts even before the year 0. Obviously, that's because of Roman law. Don't worry, even if you don't know much or hardly anything about Roman law, you'll be fine today. So I'm not supposed to be addressing, I'm not assuming that people don't know a lot of legal history. And in fact, the book doesn't assume that either. On the contrary, you might actually walk away with something new you never knew before about Roman law, and so on. So you see, it starts in Roman law, year 0. Roman law is before the year 0 and some centuries after the year 0, right? Starts in Roman law. here we're already entering the Middle Ages here, you know, the Roman Empire collapses, the Western one. And here you've got the Middle Ages in the Western, in the European West, right? Here you've got, we'll talk about some very early form of a more or less developed legal system, which arose before secular legal systems started to take their current shape. And that form of legal system I'm referring to is the legal system of the church, yeah, Catholic church in this case. And there was a huge amount of what these lawyers did that shaped what we do today, indeed what Kelsen did later on. And then we've got here roughly, you see, modernity, the birth of the state. Here we start having something like, you know, different states in the world. And I'm always speaking of Europe, of course, because that's the context in which validity arises. The beginning of sovereign states. And eventually, well, we reach our days, you know, 18th, 19th century liberal revolutions, yeah, and then World War II, and then roughly we've got Kelsen somewhere in this picture. By the way, these are the pictures that you see in the bottom, right? So you've got the Roman law picture, you've got a monastery, a medieval monastery here to look at canon law. You've got the Leviathan, yeah, the birth of the state here, and then you've got this could be Napoleon on a horse, and some of the liberal revolutions flags, the US and the French flag. If you're imaginative, you can see all that. Now let's look at what the actual graph suggests, yeah, because we've got here like two lines, and they're both broadly ascending, yeah. But they're two different lines. And here it says on the legend, it says that the continuous line is validity of transactions, and the dotted line is validity of enactments. So put in other words, the continuous line speaks about private law, validity in the private law domain. And the dotted line would speak of validity in what we now call the public law domain, and that roughly and especially means here the domain of lawmaking. Yeah, in other words, the domain in which what is valid is not simply a transaction between individuals like a contract or a marriage, but what is valid is a law itself, for example, a piece of legislation. Yeah. Now, with that in mind, yeah, if you look at the development, you'll see that these both lines ascend, yeah, throughout time, that the private law line is higher than the dotted line for much of the history, the vast majority of the time that we're looking at, of the time span we're looking at, and that only roughly around Kelsen's time, just a little bit earlier perhaps, the relationship is inverted, yeah, and that somehow the public law line, the validity of laws, seems to have the upper hand, whereas the other one is still high, but maybe not quite as prominent. Yeah? That's going to be one of the key takeaway messages that I will be trying to communicate. Yeah, the fact that the idea of validity and this concept of validity as a kind of decision making that changes duties and rights was for almost 1,800 years privy to the domain of private law. It arose in that domain. That's where it was forged. That's where it was shaped. That's where it was primarily theorized during all this time. No one would speak of the validity of norms like Kelsen does, like we naturally do today, right? It was something, a creature of the private domain. And only, as one might say, the day before yesterday, in historical terms, meaning, roughly 100, 200 years ago, the tables were turned. And now we, at least in the domain of legal theory, broadly understood, will often naturally think of validity as something associated to the validity of laws, of norms, as opposed to validity of gifts or of contracts or whatever. It's not that we deny it, but we are primarily focused on that. And I want to explain a little bit of why that evolution happened and Kelsen's role in that evolution. Now, someone might now ask me, what's the vertical line, or what's the vertical magnitude in your graph, Maris? Yeah, what makes it the case that these lines are lower in Roman law and reach much higher by the time of Savigny and Suarez? Well, that's the bit where the picture is really allegorical, right? So the allegory here is that I'm trying to capture with all the sort of tentativeness that such a picture involves. I'm trying to capture the intensity or the degree of it, the intensity, the prominence of the notion of validity in the legal thought at the time. Yeah, how important is it? How prominent is it? How often is it resorted to? How much do lawyers actually resort to that idea in their legal argument? How much do lawmakers use that idea in their actual products in their lawmaking? Yeah, so obviously there's no way you can measure it properly. Certainly no way I can think of, and I haven't tried to do it in any serious way, but I think it gets the message across. That's why it's allegorical. Now, having set up the scheme, the scene this way, I'm going to briefly talk you through the development, right? This historical development. I'm going to do it chronologically, but I'm mostly going to focus on the dotted line. So I'm going to focus on validity of enactments, right? And I'm going to be referring to the validity of in the private law, mostly by way of contrast. Yeah. So I do that because that's most relevant to what I want to say about Kelsen. Right. So Roman law, right? Roman law is a very long period of time, broad development. This handsome guy here is Gaius, one of the sort of iconic Roman jurists, yeah, and therefore textbook writers. And you've got Justinian here, who is that emperor who commissioned the compilation, the codification of Roman law that has reached our days. Yeah, so you've got Roman law roughly, between these two figures. Now, what about Roman law? Well, I've already hinted at that a while ago. Romans inchoately begin to develop the idea of validity, although they don't stably use that term, with respect to private transactions, yeah, to wills, to say when this will is actually working in good order or when it is not working because it is lacking a signature or because it has omitted one of the heirs or something like that. So they have a relatively clear idea, although not a stable word, but they have a clear idea that private transactions have to be according to law, right? That is pretty clear. They have to be according to law. They have to fulfill what we now would call criteria of validity. Of course, they wouldn't call it that way. They have that idea, and they therefore have different ways of explaining, of expressing when these transactions are a failure. Yeah, they're failing. They fail to be according to law. The law says they must have 3 signatures on a will, but hey, this will just has 2 signatures. It's a failure. Yeah, they would sometimes say it's broken. It doesn't have effect. When they say it's invalid, funnily, they use the word in the literal sense in Latin, which just means it's unhealthy or it's not in good shape, right? There's no such thing as a technical term, but you've got it. I mean, it's there incipiently, hence this line, this sort of continuous line. But what about the idea of valid laws in Roman law? Well, the short answer is that there's no such thing. In other words, there's no, especially in the sort of post-Republican and sort of the Principate and later in Roman law, so where the core of Roman law is actually written, there's no such thing as what we might call law, understood as law that in order to be law must be in conformity with further law, right? So in other words, there's no really a question about whether the highest sources of law, whether, you know, the legislation, the laws by the Senate, the dictates by the emperor and so on, it's not a legal question whether they are valid or invalid. And why is that? Well, I mean, that has a historical political explanation. As you may probably know, constitutional changes throughout the Roman period are not lawful. They are violent. They're either violent in the sense of force, there's wars behind them, coups and so on, or at least they are violent in the sense in which they simply disrupt existing legal procedures. So you pretty much, each period, a certain source of law is eventually recognized as a source of law, but it hasn't gained that status through a constitutional procedure, right? So you might say there's a break in the Grundnorm in Kelsen's terms. So therefore, legal thought doesn't really have an opportunity or a need or a possibility to reflect on the validity or invalidity of these laws, because they just, you know, one finds oneself suddenly, more or less suddenly, under the rule of a certain new powerful agent or institution. So there you are, there's no such opportunity. Plus, it's worth remembering too, that in Roman law, there isn't much enacted law anyway. So there's much of what we now would call a source of law, which is, how can I say, let me call it non-enacted, yeah? Some people might say customary law, yeah? I mean, we could argue how far it is customary or whether there are other labels that would be useful to capture that, but it's certainly not enacted, yeah? You've got the commentaries of the Juris as a source of law, they become a source of law. You've got the old jus civile, the old customs, the ancient traditions, which are also considered a source of law. You've got the magistrates' announcements of which kinds of actions they will grant, which eventually too become a source of law. And none of that is really enacted law in our sense, right? So that's another reason why legal thought doesn't have much of an opportunity to think about the validity or invalidity of particular decision-making act that might make law in the way that modern legislatures do. So that's a picture in Roman law. Let's now jump to medieval canon law. Canon law is another word for the law of the church. Now, why is it important? I've already foreshadowed that as well. In Western Europe, at least, in the Middle Ages, you've got nothing resembling states, right? You've got secular power deeply fragmented. And hence, you know, nothing, no sort of big territorial entities that could be needing to organize their legal system in a ways that might require the tools of validity. But that is different in the case of the church, because the church is, by those standards, a worldwide, of course, we mean the known world, but a worldwide entity. It has a huge territorial reach. It is trying to organize under one single heading and hierarchy, huge variety of institutions. And it's successful in doing so. And it eventually reaches a degree of complexity and success, really, in its implantation, that it requires a kind of self-organization that only law, that only a legal system will manage to give to it. Just a second, because I'm seeing there are two comments and I haven't yet been able to access them. So I'm going to see whether someone is telling me that, okay, some people is making, okay, this is Jorge sending me some notes. Okay, fine. I will normally not interrupt anymore this presentation. If there's something going on that means I should interrupt it, or some really urgent question or something, then maybe, you know, Jorge can intervene and tell me orally. Yeah, unless I hear otherwise, I will just continue talking. So the church needs to organize itself, and what do they need? They need legal categories. They need validity. They need ways. They need a grammar, a legal grammar, to be able to tell when a certain decision by a subordinate in the church hierarchy is successful or not, when it actually has changed duties and when it has not, when it has actually amounted to a consecration or not, when it has actually been, amounted to a resolution or judicial resolution of a conflict, or when not. And they borrow that category of validity from Roman law and develop it and refine it. And they have a huge development of the idea of validity in the domain of what we might call private law. In that case, I mean, in the domain of transactions between individuals, or, individual administrative decisions like consecrations of churches or whatever. So, and by the way, and that's important, actually, really important, that is the moment in our invalidity's pedigree where validity becomes to be starts to be neatly distinguished from rightness or wrongness or from obligation. Yeah. Why do the church lawyers do that? It's ironic, isn't it? Because one would have expected the church lawyers to think of, everything that's according to law as being right, and everything that's not according to law as being wrong and hence sinful. And therefore, one would have suspected canon lawyers of all people to mix what is legal and moral, and and to say that something that is invalid is wrong. But it's exactly the other way around. So canon lawyers, church lawyers do indeed think that what is legally obligatory is also morally obligatory. So, legally obligatory according to the law of the church, which ultimately is the source of morality and of justice and of rightness, according to them. And hence, what is prohibited is wrong and sinful, and what is obligatory is right and, and correct. But they use validity precisely to distinguish obligation from something else. So they use legal validity purely to say this transaction is successful or not, independently of whether it is right or wrong, independently of whether it's just or unjust, right? In fact, they are the first ones to explicitly distinguish between invalidity and sin, between prohibition and invalidity, yeah? Because they need to say, for example, that a certain kind of marriage which has been entered into by somebody who had previously started to become a religious person, like a monk, a person in the church hierarchy, so somebody who had taken simple vows, of devoting himself to a religious life, and then married, for example. Well, they want to say that is sinful, that is wrong, that is against the prohibition of the church. However, it is also legally valid. Yeah. In other words, the marriage is still valid according to the church. These people are married for all effects. However, it was sinful to do that. Yeah. And there's a distinction that we now draw very naturally, between prohibition and invalidity. Many of you may remember Hart stressing that distinction, and saying something can be prohibited and yet valid. Yeah. Hart uses the example of somebody, a thief, selling the property that they have stolen. Yeah. And he says, well, in many legal systems, in certain conditions, that contract of sale may be valid if the buyer doesn't know that it was stolen, and yet it is illegal. It is a crime. Yeah, it is both prohibited and valid, and that distinction comes straight from the medieval canon lawyers. So that's really important, the stuff they do there. But what about the dotted line? What about the validity of the laws themselves? Well, once again, it's in the backseat. Once again, a bit like happened in Roman law, but for very different reasons, canon law doesn't really envisage the question whether its laws are legally valid or invalid. And I say the reason is very different, and it's also, I think, quite easy, I would expect, for you to imagine what that reason is. Because which are the laws that they're looking at? What are their sources of law? Well, ultimately, there is scriptures, holy scriptures, and then, of course, further enactments, say, by the Pope. But as you know, under the Catholic Church doctrine, especially at that time, The Pope has a divine delegation, right? The Pope is infallible. Yeah? The Pope cannot err morally. So legal thought, therefore, cannot really open, doesn't have logical space to ask itself whether these sources of law, these laws are legally valid or invalid. I mean, the question doesn't make sense. It's absurd. It might even be a sin to raise it, right? It's a matter of faith that they are the law to be abided. Yeah? And hence, there's no logical there's not much logical space and no incentive, and hence no opportunity for legal thought to apply the logic of validity or legal validity to its laws. Now, here we've got someone who I'd love to talk to, but of course I would love to talk to him, but I meant who I'd love to talk about. But I'm gonna jump in. If somebody wants me to address him, and I'm happy to do this in the question and answers. I'm not gonna talk about Bartolo. I'm gonna go straight to Suarez and Savigny. So we are now jumping again. We're making huge jumps. We're jumping again many centuries. And I'll briefly talk about Suarez. And the reason why I'm talking about Suarez is because Suarez is one of the big theorists of validity. Much of our uses of validity are indebted to him. Of course, we're often not aware of that, right? Suarez was Spanish, from Granada, a Spanish legal scholar, Jesuit, and he has voluminous legal treatises. It's really depth of scholarship and very scholastic in its method, always arguments and counter arguments. It's fascinating, but it's really in depth. Anyway, amongst that huge opus that he has, he does theorize legal validity in, again, you guessed it, in the private law domain, right? So we are now here in this, at this moment in the history of validity. So he theorizes that distinction that I've just pointed out to you between invalidity and prohibition, which is, as I said, developed and really, resorted to by the canon, medieval canon lawyers. But Suarez, he puts really his zoom on it, and he theoretically, elevates it to a prime status, and he discusses all possible intersections between validity, prohibition, invalidity, prohibition, obligation, validity, and he does all the grid, considers all possibilities, and what is more, he distinguishes in a way that we are used to seeing Hart do, between what Hart called duty imposing rules and power conferring rules, where power conferring rules are the rules that regulate validity, right? That's what Hart tells us. Power conferring rules are the rules that tell us how to make a valid contract, a valid will, a valid legislation, a valid judicial pronouncement. Suarez, centuries before, does exactly the same distinction. He just doesn't call them with these terms. He calls them differently, but that's exactly what he means. And he spends pages and pages on that distinction. So his concept of validity is crystal clear. It's our concept of validity, and he applies it to the domain of private transaction. What about enactments? Well, you can tell the answer from the picture, right? Validity of enactments is quite considerably less developed, again, in Suarez. And now, why is that? Well, in the case of Suarez, we have to understand that because he has a very, I would say, a very muddled view of legal authority. Yeah, sharp as he is when he speaks about laws and the laws that regulate the private transaction, when he turns to explaining the authority of the lawmaker. Yeah, and he is already talking about lawmakers in sovereign states, by the way, because we're already, in the 17th century. But when he talks about that, he's unable to logically distinguish between their legal authority and their moral authority. So Suarez conceives of lawmakers as divinely empowered, and he doesn't really draw a distinction between the lawfulness, the legal validity, the correctness in law of those laws that they make, and their moral, religious correctness. Yeah, it's a shame. He has a bit of a muddled conception of legal authority, but there you are. That's a further episode, a further moment in which, for always for different reasons, but again, the validity of the laws themselves doesn't get a prime stage, doesn't get attention. And now let's make another jump of over 2 centuries to Friedrich Carl von Savigny, one of the heroes of the German historical school of law. Yeah, that's 19th century, mid-19th century, 1840. I would assume you know something about Savigny, but even if you don't, Savigny is fantastically influential doctrinal writer, philosopher, but especially doctrinal writer, whose key idea perhaps could be stated as the idea that law is the product of the spirit of a people, right? The Volksgeist. So he, develops, updates, refines existing Roman categories in order to render them fit to one day become codified. But he doesn't think Germany is yet at the stage where it should be having a civil code. Yeah, France already does have one. Yeah, the Code Napoleon. But Savigny thinks, hang on a minute, it's not yet right. We still need to doctrinally rework and digest and chew these inherited categories that the spirit of our people throughout the centuries have been developing. Yeah, and in that spirit, he writes the book. Well, once again, when it comes to the validity of transactions of private law, Savigny is another of the big hits, of the big landmark moments in its development. So Savigny develops the idea that's been especially prominent in the private law doctrine of civil law countries, of the Rechtsgeschäft, of transactions as negocio jurídico, as we would say in Spanish, and in German Rechtsgeschäft. We don't really have an equivalent in English, but just understand that he's theorizing the private transaction in terms of declarations of will. Yeah, and he's the big author that theorizes declaration of will, as he calls it, which makes up any kind of private transaction, from a gift to a marriage, to a contract, to whatever, right? And in fact, his theories about that make it straight into the later civil codes, especially the German civil code, and from there straight to our legal systems. So he has a lot to say. I mean, he makes a huge contribution to the development of the idea of legal validity in the private domain. And he's very abstract, as you would expect him to be, because he's German. And he, speaks of invalidity as an entity, as an object. It can't really get much more abstract than that. When you read him, you're like, gosh, So, he has a very robust understanding of that. But once again, what happens to the validity of the laws? What happens to the validity of the laws? Well, you see the dotted line is again quite low at the moment of Savigny. And why is that? Well, because of something I said when introducing Savigny, namely that he thinks that the real source of law is a people's spirit. And, someone today might say the real law is customary law. I mean, I hesitate to impose that label on the really complex thought of Savigny, but I may be forgiven for saying that in order to clarify the message in a very short way. So Savigny thinks that, of course, you can enact law. Of course, you can make written law. I mean, he's aware that there are, statutes out there, but he doesn't think that they're a real source of law. He thinks that they're simply a visible statement, something like an aide-memoire, a reminder of the real law, which is the one that is bred in the historically constant and developing, constant in that it is always there, developing in that it keeps changing, people's spirit. So of course, Savigny wouldn't dream of applying the notion of validity to law. In fact, he despises the way in which the French Revolution and the revolutionaries have emphasized the idea that law is something made by people, by the National Assembly on a particular act of will, the whole social contract theory that underlies the French movement. And Savigny thinks this is terrible, law is not enacted through a one-off declaration of will that could be either valid or invalid. It is bred in people's spirit. So there we are. Again, we've got no reference to the validity applied to laws. But just that way of thinking that Savigny despises, just that way of thinking that Suarez eclipses with his muddled view of legal authority, just that way of thinking that canon lawyers cannot open up to because of their belief that law, is divinely given, and just that way of thinking that Roman lawyers don't have a chance to address because of their revolutionary upheavals in constitutional terms, just that way of thinking carries the day. As especially liberal revolutions, 17th century into the 19th century liberal revolution spread and become influential in Europe. So let's focus on the French one. French Revolution and its aftermath and its contractual idea that we are there to make tabula rasa, to abolish, to overcome the old law and to found a new legal system here and now. Law is made by the proclamation of the General Assembly. Law is freshly the product of an act of will by us people, by us nation. It doesn't have a divine foundation. It doesn't have a foundation in the people's spirit. It has the foundation of this nation here and now. Now that's clearly a break with much of the preceding history. And yet, at that initial moment of revolutionary fervor in the French system, you don't yet have the idea that that law made by the legislator, by the general will, la volonté générale, that law should itself be considered legally valid or invalid. It's just by definition the law. It's almost unquestionably the law. There's no higher legal authority over that law, precisely because the French revolutionary movement is accompanied by this almost blind trust in the legislature. It's very different with the US constitutional movement, which from the beginning, or pretty much the beginning, involves a distrust for legislatures and hence a binding constitution. But let's focus on the French. That initial legislation isn't yet constitutionally limited. It's true that the aftermath after the French Revolution sees the enactment of constitutions, but they are not legally binding in a sense that is legally limiting on the legislature. In other words, the legislature's law cannot be rendered invalid because it goes against that initial French constitution. That is not how it works. So we still will have to wait some time in the European continent for that idea of law itself being valid or invalid to crystallize. And a huge role is played in that connection by the 19th century German scholarship, and not necessarily in Germany itself, but in German-speaking lands, which has this post-revolutionary aspiration to stability. This sets importance, in other words, after all the revolutionary upheavals nearby in France and so on, it aspires to the impersonal rule under law, to the rule of law, to the Rechtsstaat, to the state governed by law. We've got enough, they might say, of ideological swings, of majoritarian fiat. Yeah, it has accompanied these ups and downs and turmoils of these liberal revolutions. That's, you know, we've done it now, but we now need some stability. Legal thought must have time to catch breath. We all must catch breath. We must be able to guarantee rights, yeah, liberal rights, in a way, in a framework that is stable. We need law to provide us with that stability, with that horizon, yeah, in which we mustn't fear in sudden changes by politically accelerated majorities or coups. Yeah, you see that point. And at the same time, that goes hand in hand with a growing state administration, with a growing, you might call it public sector, right? And the need for that to be regulated by law. Yeah. And there you've got the breeding ground for what we now call public. Yeah? In other words, law that regulates the state itself. Yeah? The idea that the state itself is something under law, yeah, that's something that both makes the law, but it also is regulated by it. Yeah. That idea, which is key to the, you know, Anglophone idea of the rule of law, yeah, and to the continental idea of the Rechtsstaat, that is the idea, you can see why, that is beginning to gain a lot of doctrinal camp and political camp in the 19th century. And in that context, you can see why the idea that law itself is regulated by law, yeah, that the state itself is both the maker of law, but also the subject to law, yeah, that they're on top of the hierarchy, so to speak. We don't just have the excited national assembly of people shouting, like in France, but we've actually got something like law itself, right, that goes above them and provides the impersonal, stable, neutral framework. That idea gains a lot of popularity, and that's where the big public law scholarship contributions can develop. And in German-speaking lands, you've got someone like Otto Meyer, for example, one of the big fathers of administrative law, yeah, who sees in the idea of the administrative act the culmination of the idea of the Rechtsstaat, yeah, because it's an act that is made by the state and also regulated by law, also regulated by the state, yeah. And you've also got someone like Georg Jelinek. He's going to be important for the story, and I'm close to finishing, don't worry. Georg Jelinek, yeah, he teaches at the University of Vienna, and he theorizes public power. See if I got a quotation here. Public power, the power of the state, as a power that cannot be derived from any other further source. It is a power that arises from itself, he says. State power. Yeah? State power is governing power that cannot be derived from any other source. It is governing power arising from himself, yeah? From itself. And he writes a book, General Theory of the State, yeah, where he portrays law for the first time really in famous scholarship as a set of norms, yeah, and these norms are primarily characterized by their validity, yeah, and this big book, this magnum opus, appears in the year 1900, yeah, it's the same year that Germany's BGB comes into force, the German Civil Code, and all that happens at the University of Vienna. Now, as a student, at that time, yeah, think about it for a moment. You go and study law at that time in that place, yeah. You receive this heritage of law governing law mentality, yeah. This idea that it is not politics, it is not morality, it is not sociological fiat, but it is actually law itself that regulates itself, right? And you receive that newly found passion, especially by public lawyers, yeah, to make sense of the legal system as a whole in terms of norms as the abstracted product of the law, of the making of law, right? And their passion for applying that to the private realm, yeah, because you will remember, for example, I mean, it's not only that many doctrines in administrative law at that time are built on a mirror, so are replicating private law doctrines. They're just borrowed from the private law and they are applied to the public law domain. Yeah, but it's also that, for example, even the French Civil Code says that contracts have the force of laws amongst parties. Yeah, so there's this fascination for looking at the public law, at the lawmaking as it were the paradigm of law, and applying that to the domain of private law. So that's what you sort of breathe when you study law at that point. And one of these students is Hans Kelsen. He reads law at the University of Vienna, where Jelinek has taught. Yeah, and now we might say that Kelsen does a further step, right? He extends and generalizes the logic of the Rechtsstaat, of the law governed by law, to the whole of the legal system. Yeah, Kelsen isn't limited to the domain of public law. He's not simply a public lawyer. He's one who actually absorbs that logic and reflects it throughout, to the point that even transactions, even private contracts, are, you know, articulated on the model of laws as norms, right? The metric, the common metric that runs through this whole self-governed system is validity. Yeah, we've got valid norms, valid contracts, valid, and so on. And the unit to which this metric applies is the norm, the valid norm. Yeah, and that is, and what is the norm? Well, the norm is ultimately, you might say, the abstracted product of the lawmaking act. Yeah, although eventually, of course, in Kelsen it has a very technical definition. Yeah, but legal thought, as it were, is keen to think of the norm as the abstracted, once again, impersonal. You can see the connection between that and all the 19th century concern with the impersonal rule of law, with the, you know, segregation of law as, you know, acts of will from the actual product of those acts of will, the stable, neutral framework. Now, of course, we know that these two aspects coexist in Kelsen. Yeah? Kelsen doesn't simply throw out of the window this whole notion of laws as, you know, created by act of will. On the contrary, they coexist in him. They beautifully, magisterially coexist. His whole static versus dynamic account of law, right? His whole distinction between norms and the acts of will that underlie these norms. They provide a really rich grammar, which legal thought, the newly born legal thought, you know, in 19th, 20th century, can borrow from in both, as it were, maintaining the heritage of the Rechtsstaat, of the, you know, stability of the law governed by law, of the public law paradigm, while at the same time being able to adapt to new decisions, new commitments, new acts of will, no foundations. And I'm saying that especially, of course, after the Second World War. Now, of course, Kelsen starts writing before the Second World War, but notice what happens after that, right? After that, as finally in the European continent too, there becomes, I mean, there's the consciousness is extended that you need legally binding limits on the legislature. Yeah? Think of Germany post-World War, right? Think of its influential step of creating a legally binding constitution. In other words, a constitution in light of which law itself may be valid or invalid, legally valid or invalid. The product of statutes, yeah, the norms that come from statutes, the legislation, yeah, what the French had considered to be the ultimate source of law are now considered to be a source that may itself be struck down through a constitutional court by appeal to a yet higher source of law, which is the Constitution. And of course, as I said, the US had done that a century or so earlier, but we just were a little bit late. But there we are, we finally got there. And legal thought, because of these political social developments, is in desperate need for a legal grammar, a legal tool set that it will enable it to conceptualize this idea of law itself lawmaking itself being valid or invalid, and hence legal norms themselves being valid or invalid. And that grammar, that tool set is right there in Kelsen's writings. So no wonder they have this magnificent influence, yeah, and they become really spread like nothing else in theoretical and doctrinal circles. I'm not saying there are not many other reasons for this. I'm not trying to suggest that. I'm saying that this is one context in which, if you see his place in the history of validity, he's, I would say, in a sense, his work is the offshoot of all that context that I've explained, all that change of mentality, all that, as it were, awareness of legal thought, that law itself can be valid or invalid. Not only contracts and marriages can be valid or invalid in law, but law itself, that thing that validated the contracts, but it itself could be valid or invalid, right? So I think Kelsen's work is in some ways the offshoot of that, but it also contributes to further sharpening, right? So it's really a hinge between that. He's in the right place in the right moment. He provides legal thought with these tools, and especially post-World War II, as I say, where legal thought wishes to both preserve the heritage of the Rechtsstaat, of law governed by law, stability, rule of law on the one hand, but it also wishes to found nations on fresh commitments, very often in the name of human rights, right? Which will go to the constitutions as legally binding limits on what legislatures can do. At that moment, Kelsen's dual embracement of static and dynamic, of norms and acts, of legal limits, and yet legal lawmaking power. His edifice in which law regulates itself, law controls itself, to the point that law even controls its lack of control. But that's Kelsen's overstatement perhaps of some of his doctrines. He is providing that which legal thought both it's both a consequence, I would say, of that change in legal thought, of that graph that you're seeing here, of that history, but it also actively contributes to it. And I think that is the turning point from the point of view of legal theory as well, or Western legal theory, let's say, that has made it so natural for many of us, or at least it did so for many years, to think of validity as something primarily associated to norms, right? So when I used to say to people that I was writing on validity back when I was doing my doctorate, yeah, people said, "Oh, right, so you're writing about valid norms. Oh, you're writing about the criteria of validity, right? Are you writing about sources, and are you writing about whether criteria of validity are moral or not moral, and so on?" And well, that wasn't just what I was writing about. Not saying that it's not useful to speak of validity as associated to norms, but it's very important to see that in an important sense, we are a product of these historical developments, and relatively recent ones, when we think of validity as primarily associated to norms. Nothing wrong with doing it, but it's not the only way this has been done. Kelsen has been hugely influential, but it's also worth knowing what the influence on Kelsen himself was. One of them, no doubt, there were many others, yeah? And let me simply conclude on the note of saying, look, one thing that this history may help us see, even beyond Kelsen, is that we've grown so used to associate validity to the laws of a state, yeah, to state law. I mean, of course, Kelsen is our big hero on validity. He's the great influence on later writers on validity, on Hart and so on. And Kelsen, for one, thinks of law and the state as being the same thing, as closely associated, right? But if you just look back, yeah, over your shoulder to these 18 centuries of validity talk and validity reasoning that come before Kelsen, you will find that validity has been born as a tool set, quite separate from any idea of national state, quite separate from that. And it might be worth reflecting on whether now, as we begin to, or continue to question the existence of states, the logic of sovereignty, yeah, the separation of the world into state jurisdictions, as we begin to, or continue to query the growing importance of suprastate, international legal orders, economic legal orders, digital legal orders dissociated from the traditional picture of the state, it might be worth remembering that this one tool, legal validity, which has withstood the test of time, might come handy for it. And we shouldn't wrongly sort of associate it to a national state-related legal theory, because I think there's much more which it can offer. And I think a brief look at the ancestors and the earlier writers will give us cues about how we ourselves, somebody in our generation, can help us take the history of validity one step further, thanks to Kelsen, but also beyond Kelsen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maris. A pleasure. I have to say a pleasure. Let me cancel the screen share. And all the attendees, get ready for questions and answers. We'll have, if you're okay, Maris, 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah, I mean,
and answers. Before anybody else, one disagreement. When you said you are not an expert, I have to disagree. The presentation was very, very interesting. I have to disagree with that, honestly. The other thing I wanted to say, catching up, your conceptual precision, to me, clearly from your presentation, I have questioned myself, but I'm going to be very, very briefly, giving you a bit of feedback to give time, for the other question. Your conceptual precision, you clearly separated between the ontic, the ontological, and the epistemological. So what I see and what I'm myself as an author, I'm developing, you are doing a multidimensional analysis rather than unidimensional analysis. You clearly, to me, introduce validity, and you talk about a norm and act of will, so they can coexist. And again, I don't want to be kind with you. It's simply I have to agree, because it's the same view I have. In legal theory and in legal philosophy, we tend to see many papers in Congress, in books as well, the efficacy or the validity, as if they were enemies. That's why the way you put it, norm and act of will coexist. That is why, to me, you clearly distinguish what Kelsen does. Epistemological, that's his claim, epistemological from ontic or ontological. And the other thing that you did, and I have to say, I've done myself, so it's a coincidence, we never talk about this, you set the context, and that's how so important to me. What you did with validity, I did myself a few publications, to be very short, a book back in 2017, a set of papers, the last of the papers being 2019, and I put the link about a positive claim from Bodin and Hobbes. When they brought to the Western world state sovereignty as a concept. The concept was there. If we even go to the Quran or the Bible, the holy books, the concept of sovereignty was applied at the level of the individual before. I talk about Aristotle, Plato, and so on. But it's only Bodin and Hobbes who have a positive claim. And again, history is that time in history when positivism, not legal positivism, positivism came into place. And that's when Bodin and Hobbes, because of the historical context, and it's a funny, you mentioned the church, because I do the same distinction between the church and the state. Mm-hmm. They were fighting for power, which is a factual issue, fight for power, and they created the idea of the state, the illusion. And you mentioned the Leviathan, which I do as well, or the Leviathan. Very interesting presentation, and if I may, and I'm going to send an email later, I'm going to push for a publication. I know you are busy, and I'm going to definitely send you my paper or my book, because I would be interested in having your opinion. Very, very, very similar understanding. That's me. I have Gonzalo here. Do we have, before Gonzalo, because we are any other questions or comments from anybody else? Please open your mic and simply fire the question if you do. Anybody? If not, Gonzalo, I'll give you the turn, and then I'm going to check the attendees. Is that okay, Gonzalo?
Yes, I have only a small question. I was a little surprised as in this picture is most concentrated or focused on continental law. Mm-hmm. But what happened with the English and in Anglo-Saxon theory. I mean, what role did play, for example, Bentham and Austin and other theoreticals in his picture?
Well, thanks for that question, Gonzalo. Shall I briefly say something about Jorge's question? I mean,
if you want, you can take.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that's a very useful way of putting it. That you say deontological, epistemological, multidimensional. I mean, these are not terms I would have used, but I can see what you mean. I think, and it makes sense. Norms and active wills coexisting. Well, I mean, you know, I would say they belong to different dimensions, right? I mean, they coexist, but you know, you can think of you reason and think of. And we do that in ordinary legal reasoning too. Sometimes we speak of law as norms. Yes, what is the rule on X? And that rule can be made up of different sources. Yeah, but we just speak of the norm as the product, the proposition that emerges from all these different sources. And sometimes we speak of the sources themselves. We say, oh, this was a valid will. Oh, it wasn't a valid. It was invalid. Yeah. So I think, you know, we switch back and forth in ordinary legal reasoning between these two whatever dimensions, right? And so I mean, I couldn't agree more that is the right thing. I'm not sure though whether I would associate efficacy to acts of will. I mean, I think of efficacy as something that is more like the aftermath, the effect of an enacted provision, and see whether it actually has a certain impact on the world. Yeah, and that's, as it were, the output. And I think of acts of will as the input. Right? So I would be more careful to equate these two, but it's of course also another important dimension. And as for Gonzalo's question, I'm afraid all I can say is that it merits an investigation of its own. I did want to throw the light on these continental writers, first because in the English-speaking world, we sometimes overlook them, or we simply are, you know, not really aware of our indebtedness to them. And second, because I think historically they do carry most of the innovative power. Now, it's true that it's impossible to write a history of validity that takes account of all landmark texts. It's impossible. And about each landmark text, one could write not one book, several books, right? And so inevitably one has to make a selection, and it's clear that Bentham, maybe not so much Austin, but you know, Bentham would have made a contribution. But I mean, of course he makes a contribution, and there's lots to be said about that. But to my mind, I think the historically prior and more relevant, perhaps more relevant contributions are those of Suarez, Samigny, specifically on validity. We're not talking about legal thought in general, right? We're talking about the notion, the concept of legal validity. So therefore, one reason, I'd rather look at authors that we overlook in the English tradition. Second reason, I think relatively to Bentham, those here have more to say specifically on the notion of validity. And can't think of where. I thought there was a third reason, but I'm now not able to produce it. It definitely would merit an investigation of its own, Gonzalo. So, you know, it would be worth studying what influence these people had on Bentham, and in turn how Bentham may have shaped other later works, both in the continent. I mean, we know how he shaped the Anglo-Saxons theorists, right? But it would be very worth studying. Yeah, very much so. And people before Bentham as well. I hope somebody does it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Maris. Before, of course, I agree with you about validity and efficacy, exactly what you say, input and output, I completely agree. What I try to say is, you know, the factual and the logical side. But thank you, that was very, 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 very clear. We have a comment on Twitter, actually. Someone that is probably present with us. You said, brilliant, Maris Köpcke, the limiting validity of transactions and validity of enactments, claiming Kelsen played a significant role in the latter, overtaking the former in the jurisprudential discourse. That was Twitter.
I think that's a very good summary.
Yeah, Completely, yeah, completely.
Well, not the very kind evaluative words about me, but the actual summary of the content.
You are far too modest, yeah. And I have to agree with that, because to be able to put that comment on Twitter, you know, with the limitations we have on Twitter,
yeah, it's great.
Spot on. I'm sure, you know.
Spot on.
Yeah, spot on. So whoever put that comment on Twitter, yes, spot on. But that's why I wanted to read this live, Maris. You know, so you see that, you know, what people are saying. Anna Lukina, perfect. Thank you, Anna. And we have Anna Taitslin as well. She has Anna, are you there? She has a question about Jelinek and Kelsen. Anna? Are you there, Anna? Anna Taitslin.
She may be silenced. I think she's silenced.
Probably. She says something. I'll read it. Hello, yeah?
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, perfect, yeah.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned Jelinek. Can you say, because there was some disagreement, isn't it, between Jelinek and Kelsen? Can you say something?
Well, yes, thank you, Anna. That's a very important, that's a very interesting question. And you're right that I simply focused on, in my very brief comments, on the ways in which they coincide. I'm going to take the liberty of pointing you to a text that answers this question, and I've just pasted it on the chat. So a very useful article by Stanley Paulson, yeah, called Hans Kelsen's Earliest Legal Theory, Critical Constructivism. And here he discusses very helpfully the ways in which, sorry, it should say legal theory. For some reason, the TH didn't make it to my copy paste. But there we are, yeah.
Thank you so much.
There he explains that, yeah. And it's very useful.
And thank you for your presentation.
Thank you too.
And you lead me to say something. I will send this to Stanley Paulson and Bonnie as well, Maris, so he will see this. Why I'm saying this, he sent his apologies. Unfortunately, Bonnie had an accident this week. Yeah, she's in hospital. So that's why he cannot, yes, many people. So that's why he was going to be present with us. Unfortunately, he sent his apologies. So thank you, Maris, and I have the pleasure to let you know that he will receive your video with this presentation.
Yeah, sure. I'm so sorry to hear about Bonnie. I'm gonna drop
apparently it's a small accident, you know, her wrist.
Okay.
So she may not need an operation, but he did send all his wishes to all the presenters, keynotes as well. Yeah. So you gave me the opportunity, you know, to address this. Thank you very much, Maris. Any other comment or question? Anybody else? No?
If I can.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Gonzalo, yeah.
I have the impression that the whole research. I'm very happy for hearing this presentation. It was amazing. But I have at the same time the impression that you assume that there is one single concept of validity, and that is a presupposition that is needed for your research. Could you perhaps make explicit what is this concept of validity?
Thank you for your that's another really sharp question, Gonzalo. Thank you. It's a privilege to be at the receiving end here. And well, of course, there are many different ways to think of validity conceptually, yeah, especially you know, the question, what are we saying about something when we're saying that it is valid, right? So the question, whether are we saying it is a member of the system? Are we saying it is binding? Are we saying it is binding in law? Are we saying, you know, and so on and so forth. I mean, we've, you know about that much more than I am, sure. But I'm trying to, in tracing the history, I mean, I've got, how can I say? Now, two things, right? One is that I am looking at not what all these people throughout 2000 years thought they were saying about something when they said it is valid, but rather to something prior and more simple, which is what kinds of acts and what kind of human acts was validity associated with, right? And I think that whatever one thinks about the first question, right, one can probably agree that the kind we speak of something as valid in law, right, legally valid, when that's something, I mean, the things we speak of as valid are characteristically acts or products of acts, right? And not just any act, not just any random act, but acts that involve an manifestation of will, right? That involve somebody saying something. Could also be by silence, through gestures and so on, but you know, it's a propositional content, yeah, something that has meaning, saying something, however brief or however extended, yeah. And through that saying, yeah, the normative changes that are being said are actually take place in the legal system. Yeah, you might call it performative if you want. It's a fashionable word, which is a bit confusing, but you know, it's just I create changes in legal duties and rights and powers. How? By saying that I wish to create them through this very act of saying. Yeah. In English, we mark that out through the word hereby. Yeah. We hereby bequeath this estate. I hereby sell you my watch. It is hereby, be it hereby enacted by your majesty, and so on and so forth, right? So whatever we think is it where we are saying about that act or about that contract or about that will or about that statute, by saying it is valid, whatever it is that we think we're saying about it, yeah. The thing that all these instances have in common is that they're predicated of acts that involve a manifestation of will, which manifestation of will changes legal rights and duties through that very manifestation of will, yeah. And that's in fact what I call the technique of validity, yeah. And by that simply I mean it's one way of changing legal rights and duties. Yeah? It's one way, a very convenient way, a very extended way. It's not the only way, right? If I hit you on the nose, I'm also changing legal rights and duties, yeah. I become liable to certain criminal sanctions. I've broken a criminal obligation. You become, you know, entitled to some kind of compensation. The powers of the judge in our jurisdiction also change. He or she becomes now empowered to hear our case, and so on and so forth. There are plenty of ways of changing legal rights and duties, but this is not a valid way. I didn't validly hit you on the nose, or invalidly. It's just not the kind of thing that you would call valid or invalid. Right? The kind of thing is a transaction, enactment, a declaration of will. So that is the first consideration I wanted to say. So I'm focusing on the minimum denominator, as you might say, of the things that in law are valid. That's what I call the technique of validity. And that pretty much can be identified throughout the ages. And the second consideration is that as it happens, your first question, so the first question, namely the question, what are we saying of something when we are saying it is valid, is not a question that is really addressed by these earlier writers, because they don't really have, I mean, initially, because in the first kinds of centuries, Roman canon law, validity is, I mean, I don't want to say they're not abstract enough. Of course, these people are very smart and they're abstract, but they don't devote their legal abstraction powers to the concept of validity. They devote them to something else. Validity is simply a tool, is simply a notion that they keep using each time more. And it's only when the notion becomes really extended and really crucial that we find people like Suarez or Savigny who say, okay, let's focus on it, right? But even they, I mean, look at Suarez, all he writes about it, but even he doesn't really address your question. Yeah, even he doesn't say, what are we saying of something we're saying it is valid. He discusses the rules that regulate criteria of validity, right? He speaks about the acts, this declaration of will. Suarez has a avant la lettre discussion of legislative enactments, ironically, yeah, of the declaration of will that is sort of, you know, making law by saying it wants to make law. Yeah, this sort of self-referring, self-implementing declaration of will of the lawmaker, as well has a beautiful avant la lettre discussion of that. Savigny, in turn, has an equivalently beautiful discussion of the private declaration of will. But they don't, neither of them actually asks, what are we saying of something when we're saying it is valid? It's only really much more contemporary writers, Kelsen, of course, and you guys, yeah, and people who have written in our generation and just the generation before, who have actually become so fascinated by validity, and validity has become so prominent in our legal thought. And in fact, legal theory has become itself as a discipline so extended as a discipline in its own right that people have actually found the opportunity and the reason to ask themselves the question. Yeah, what is the concept of validity you're using? Is it validity as membership? Is it validity as binding force? Is it all of them? So these are the two reasons why I haven't made reference to it. Yeah, to repeat, first reason, I'm not asking that question. I'm asking at what is common to the various acts that are valid, and that is, I think, to be agreed. You can agree to that regardless of what your concept of validity is. And the second is that there just isn't any. I haven't been able to find at least any discussion of different concepts of validity, of legal validity in the historical text. That is not to say that it's not an interesting question. That is not to say that it's not an important question. Right? It's just not a question that I could address, that it was even possible or relevant to address in that research. I'm not sure if that answers.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up, we have Thomas. Thomas, I think you have a question. Thomas Whitlock.
Yes.
Yep.
Just a small question. Thank you for that. That was an amazing presentation. And just a short question. I'm just curious about your opinion. Would you agree that for Kelsen, the primary understanding or the fundamental understanding of validity is simply validity is existence of law? Because it occurs to me that it is, but I'm very curious what you think about it.
Gosh, thank you, Thomas. I'm probably not the right person to ask this, right? I mean, as I said, I'm not such an expert on Kelsen, but you've reminded me that, of course, validity as existence is one of the other prominent answers to the question that Gonzalo was posing, right? What concept of validity do you use? And I forgot this one. I don't know how I forgot it, but there you are. Kelsen, does he think as validity as existence of law, or rather as existence of laws, right? Of laws plural, meaning of norms, right? I mean, we all know that Kelsen, one of the concepts of validity he uses, especially in the general theory of norms, his sort of later work, right, is validity as ideal existence. Yeah, validity is the ideal existence, the ideal existence of norms. Yeah. But it's not the only concept of validity he uses. And I mean, my understanding, I wouldn't want to go as far as to say it is his primary concept. I might say, you know, there's different phases in Kelsen's thought, all of which are worth in looking at. And within each phase, there are, you know, different passages and different moments, different junctures in his argument. You know, because he, as I briefly said in my talk, he distinguishes different aspects of law, the dynamic and the static one, and that's a distinction that sort of you find replicated in various points in his theory, whether under this name or not. And so, you know, I guess validity as existence of norms would be primarily belonging to the static concept of law, right? So to law as a set of norms. But I wouldn't want to pronounce on the question. I'm not sure whether you could answer that question in general terms, really, whether for the whole of Kelsen, for all his aspects of theory, for all his sort of professional lifespan, there is one, this concept of validity is more important than the others. My understanding of Kelsen, or my knowledge, isn't enough to make such a broad claim. And from what I do understand and do know of Kelsen, my answer would be it depends on the period you're asking about, Thomas, and it depends on the part of the theory you're asking about. Are we talking about the static concept of law? Are we talking about his discussion of conflicts of norms, which is a whole problem in its own right? Are we talking just of his general definition of a norm? No doubt there's some interesting work and to be done in that connection. Yeah, but I wouldn't want to pin myself to any of these concepts as being more or less important. I mean, do you have a sense of that, Thomas? Do you want to tell us?
It's just that every time I want to say that law exists, it comes to me that law is valid. So, of course, in Kelsenian terms.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah, law exists. Do you mean law in general as a whole legal system? Because I wonder what the Kelsen would say of a whole legal system, that it is valid. I mean, I would think of him as validity. I mean, validity, isn't it? It's intrasystemic. And by the way, that's true of validity since its inception in Roman law, right? Validity is always valid with respect to some system. Yeah, is this valid according to the rules of the university? Is this valid according to the rules of Spanish law? Is this valid according to the rules of whatever? Right. So validity can only, I think, be predicated with respect to something. Yeah, I mean, it couldn't be otherwise. Yeah. If you say something, this is a valid ticket, well, what are the criteria of validity, you would ask? Yeah, show them to me. Let's check them. Right? So valid within something. So I'm not sure whether on Kelsen or indeed on anyone else, it makes sense to say that the legal system as a whole is valid, unless you take a supra sort of state perspective and say it is valid according to international law, right? But if the historically first constitution, or it can be valid according to the Grundnorm, but that's it, right? But again, it's the historically first constitution that is valid, not the system as a whole. I mean, some people might know better than me here, but my sense is that Kelsen doesn't really speak of the system as a whole being valid or invalid, but rather the highest norm in that system, or any particular norm in that system as being valid, right? So I don't think a system can be valid or invalid. I think it can exist or not exist, right? And I think that's what Kelsen would agree with, but if somebody knows better, then please let me know. When it comes to norms, however, then I think validity and existence can pretty much go hand in hand, right? Because if it's valid, it exists, right? And if it exists, it is valid. How can it exist and be invalid? Unless we stipulate that by existence we mean something else. Yeah, I mean, words are sometimes not self-explanatory. What if by existence we mean it has been taken into account by a court, although it was invalid? The court made a mistake, right? It was an invalid law, but hey, the courts took it into account and they have just ordered a judgment and they have just locked somebody up in the name of this invalid law. Does that law exist? Not in the sense of Kelsen's ideal existence, of course, it is invalid. So, but if you want to take a sociological sense of existence, or maybe an efficacy-related sense of existence, or indeed, if you want to distinguish as Scandinavian legal realists do, right, between different concepts of validity, one of which isn't really validity, but is something more like vigencia in Spanish, right? I don't think we have an English equivalent for that. Then maybe we can say that they don't go hand in hand. So I think you just need to explain what you mean by existence, yeah? And I use this opportunity to point everyone to the new translation of Alf Ross on law and justice. So as you probably will remember, Alf Ross was for a long time quite unhelpfully translated into English, such that where Ross was drawing a distinction that you have in Scandinavian and also in Germanic languages between two senses of the word, or two words really, validez, vigencia in Spanish, and Gültigkeit, Geltung in German. He was, however, for a long time translated in both cases as saying validity, as not drawing any distinction. And Hart famously misread Alf Ross, and famously, attacked him in his writings for missing. In fact, it was, Hart misread him, and it wasn't his fault, of course, but Ross felt unjustly criticized, and has, there's this sort of various articles that where Hart and Ross address each other. And so, finally, this historical injustice has been put right by an edition of the OUP, an OUP edition of On Law and Justice, edited by Jacob Holtermann at Stockholm, he's in Denmark, at Copenhagen. So yeah, I encourage you to look at that, because maybe there you will find some much stuff for thought in terms of different senses of existence is distinguished to validity.
Thank you very much. I need to wrap up because we have Anna in Canberra. Before we go, thank you, Maris. Thank you, Thomas, for the comments. I have a question myself about your methodology. I don't want you to answer, Maris, but I'm going to continue the chat probably by email because it's an interesting methodology you use, especially the story or history behind. And I completely agree with your point. I assume why, but I'd like to, to know more about that. In particular, Thomas's question, I had a paper, and Kelsen clearly distinguished, but sometimes people omit that in law. He distinguishes a rational, a physical, and a psychological angle. That's why sometimes, and that's what I meant, by efficacy before and validity, because Kelsen talks the three languages, when he applies law, when he applies coercion. That's why the Hart and his between inverted commas criticism about coercion, because Hart missed the point. Kelsen was referring to the rational side, and Hart refers to the psychological or physical side of coercion. So the complaint between inverted commas from Hart was unfair, because although he was talking about the same concept, he talked about a different conception. He didn't capture Kelsen, I dare to say, and I argue about that specific point in one of my papers. So that's why, Maris, I wanted to say. Well, thank you very much. And again, my own question would be for you, not for now, please, because we have Anna, but your methodology, because I find the presentation very interesting, but your methodology, to me, very inspiring, because I feel more people should do that. Rather than taking concepts for granted, we should go back to the roots, like you did. Again, I follow the same, and what you did with validity, I did myself with state and sovereignty. We've used the concept before. They are very old concepts with very different conceptions, and we tend to assume we talk the same language. And when we use the concept in, again, talking about the history as you did, or talking about different disciplines, even now, when we are a political scientist or a lawyer or a philosopher, we seem to apply the same concept when in reality we apply different understandings of the same concepts. So thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure.
Can I just say that any merit there is in this method, it is John Finnis's merit, because he advised me to do that back when I was a doctoral student.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Amazing. Very modest of you. And vigencia is efficacy. Bullying has a very, very, many things, but I can send you the links. He clearly distinguishes different conceptions of validity. One of them, validity equates to efficacy, and efficacy in Spanish can be eficacia or vigencia. Yes? So they are synonyms. Thank you very much. Thanks
to you guys for all your great questions.
Thank you. Anna, it's my pleasure now to introduce from Canberra directly. Again, for the ones that are joining us right now, I have to say Dr. Wei Feng from China, he cannot be with us. He had an accident 2 days ago. Right now he's in hospital, and he was very kind to try to offer his presentation via Zoom from hospital. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us. We wish him well, and thank you for his effort. But right now we will have Dr. Anna Taitslin, presenting from Canberra, Australia. And thank you, Anna, because Anna has been with us all 3 roundtables since back in April. So she's part of our original project a few months ago. Anna will talk about norm and wait a second here. Kelsen's basic norm and Hart's secondary rules in comparative study of the 20th century's revolutionary legal change in Russia and Germany. And before I let Anna have the floor, I have to say you, Anna, that we have Professor Mikhail Antonov from Russia, St. Petersburg, our next keynote speaker after the break. So you will have quite a tough work in convincing him, because I know his work. And before we go, we have as well from Barbados, because I'm conscious it's very early, Asia, one of our speakers later as well. So thank you, Spasiba, Mikhail, thank you, o gracias, Asia, for joining us. And now the floor is for Dr. Anna Taitslin from Canberra. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, George. Can you see my screen or no? No, so because I want to share screen. All right, I will do it.
Yeah, you may share now, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, it's working, yeah.
All right. All right. Something almost following for the previous very interesting talk, and particularly this variant discussion about validity as kind of link to the Kelsen basic norm. All right. So what the focus is on the shift from one legal order to another as a result of a revolutionary transformation in terms of the Kelsen basic norm. So the 2 case study, and there was 2 periods in Russia from February Revolution to which followed collapse of the Russian Empire and establishment of provisional government, and October Revolution, which overturned this provisional government and established Bolshevik regime. All right, Germany, November Revolution, as we will see, it's very similar. It would be very similar that led collapse to the German Empire, and then there was a summon of a constituent or national assembly in early 19, creating of this is the second period, creating of so first period from November Revolution to National Assembly, second period from the Weimar Republic to the establishment of Nazi regime in 1993, 1994. All right, so what is the framework? What is theoretical framework? What is Kelsen has discussion of revolutionary change in general theory of law and state, and also in pure theory of law. So he described it as any change of legal order in a way not prescribed by this order. And he also noticed that it's irrelevant where the replacement is effected from the movement emanating from the mass of the people or from the action of those in the government position. I think it's this elaboration there is in general theory of law, but I think it's missing from the pure theory second edition. But for our case, particularly for the Nazi takeover, it is important elaboration. His another point is that if all the order cases, the new order begins to be efficacious, because the individual, those behavior the new order regulates, actually behave by and large in conformity with the new order, and this order is considered as a valid order. All right, so you have this kind of criterion of the efficacy, which show you the change of the order. So if the revolutionary fail, fails if the order they have tried to establish remains inefficacy. Then the undertaking is interpreted as a legal act and as a treason. So there is no overturn of a basic norm in this particular case. So you have two cases. One case of successful revolution. So you can see revolution as a process. It's starting from some point, but it can be successful and cannot be successful. We return for this efficacy criterion later, then we will discuss the Kelsen analysis of the Weimar Republic crisis, constitutional crisis of 1932. All right. So what is the basic norm? So his early Kelsen early understanding of a basic norm, and of course, generally by basic norm, it is the norm which validity of legal order is anchored to, and from which all other norms could be derived. So it actually is the criterion of validity. And in the Porphyry 1, basic norm is defined is whatever the framers of the first constitution have expressed as their will, but it's also defined as transcendental logical presupposed condition and also hypothetical one. In Porphyry second edition, it is described as basic norm is limited to authorized to a norm created authority. But since there is no change in this transcendental logical presupposed condition with respect to Porphyry 1 and Porphyry 2. So, and the general theory of law is state, the whole function of a basic norm is to confer law creating power on the act of the first legislature, and all our other acts based on the first act. So function is above all is delegation. But he also said, coming to issue of coercion, the basic norm is not just whatever the supreme authority commands shall be done. It's more exactly reads, under certain condition laid down by the supreme authority, coercion is to be applied in fashion determined by the authority. All right, but then I will say what is basic norm. I actually will use these short definitions. It's something which authorities command, but we will keep in mind that there is this coercion which is behind it. However, later in his life, starting from Functional Constitution of 1964 and also in Theory of Norms, which was unfinished, he defined basic norm already not as a hypothesis, but as a fiction. The basic norm is mere thought norm. The assumption of basic norm not only contradicts reality, since no such norm exists as the meaning of actual act of will, but also contain contradiction within itself, since it represents the empowering ultimate legal authority, and so emanate from an authority, admittedly a fictitious authority, higher than this one. So this is clearly a fiction. So you have a fictitious authority from which this norm emanates. All right. So what is the distinction between Kelsen and the Hart? He also has something which look like kind of approximation to the basic norm, because Hart said that when validity of statute has been cleared and assessed by reference to the rule that what the Queen in Parliament enacts is a law. Of course, he referred to UK constitution. We have reached a rule which, like the intermediate statutory order and statute, provide criteria for assessment of the validity of our rules. But it's also unlike them in that there is no rule providing criteria for assessment of its own validity. So here you are, something similar. However, I would think it's not quite the same. And actually, what Hart said himself in Concept of Law, that some emphasize the legal ultimacy of a rule of recognition, whereas validity of other rules can be demonstrated by reference to it. And they say this validity cannot demonstrate, but it assume, or is hypothesis, they may be seriously misleading. The rule of recognition, which we referred just before, is actually accepted and employed in the general operation of a system. For wherever the subordinate rule of a system may be valid, in that sense exist, even if generally disregarded, the rule of recognition exists only as a practice of a court official and private person in identifying the law by reference to certain criteria. It is existent as a matter of fact. So clearly you have a great, and I think previous discussion actually also pointed, coming to this similar almost point, that for him it was a matter of fact, but of course it wasn't a matter of fact for Kelsen, particularly in his later period, that it was a pure fiction. All right, but not only, of course, in hard concept of law, you have a rule of recognition, but you also have secondary rules, rules of change that specify the legislative provisions for change, and you have a rule of adjudication, which identified the individual who are to adjudicate, and also procedures and concept of a judge in court. All right, and there is this distinction in Hart between primary and the secondary rule. And the primary rule would be rule of criminal law, of law of obligation, and so on. All right, so here I'm just summing up. So you have, so what I take from this analysis that that Hart cannot actually refer to the first historical kind of basic norm, because this is a fiction, and for him it is just the highest norm would be queen in a parliament, which is not a basic norm in the Kelsen sense, because the Kelsen sense it will be fictional authority which actually creates this norm. All right. So now I move to, I finish with this theoretical framework by basic norm and the secondary Hart secondary rules. So I think they define different things. So basic norm tell us the is the norm which can show us the break, revolutionary break and shift from the one legal order to another. However, and look, there is a bit of perhaps point which Hart, which Kelsen making here is right, because he said even if you have some rules which would continue to exist, it's not the old rule. It's example of reception. All right, you have example of reception, but in the same times, they have this scope of a change. And this scope of a change can be showed by the Hart secondary rule. So we can look on the Hart secondary rule and actually say what was the actual scope of a change with respect to this rule of recognition, a rule of change, and of course, rule of recognition, rule of change would go hand of hand, and rule of adjudication. But there's another point which is very important with respect to revolutionary change. It's this distinction between normative and prerogative state. Because if we can actually think about revolutionary change, it's very clear revolution change by definition does not come from the normative state, because it's actually destroy the previous normative state. So it's kind of product of a prerogative power. And this Frankel distinction from his well-known book Dual State, of course, seems to have also direct relevance to the issue of revolutionary change. So here I move to the first example. First example is the February Revolution in Russia, started in Petrograd with the street protest on 23rd of February of 1917. 22nd of February, there was suspension of the Государственная Дума, which was low house of the parliament, and Государственный Совет, which was high, not elected upper house. look, interestingly enough, this suspension was the result of these emergency powers, which was in the person of a Tsar by the main law of 1906. So here you have this emergency power, and then we will discuss Weimar Republic. You can see this emergency power, which sort of kind of creates this lagoon of prerogative state within normative state. All right, so on 27th of February, there was a provisional committee was formed by the group of members of this suspended parliament. All right, but they were not the government themselves. They actually formed the provisional government with consultation with Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputy in this period was controlled by more moderate socialists. Moderate socialists believe at the time that firstly there should be bourgeois revolution to succeed, and then should be progressing to the socialist revolution. All right. So this was sort of left liberal government. So then on this stage. On the 2nd of March, Nikolai, last Russian Tsar, Nikolai II, abdicated, not only for himself, but also for his minor son, which still a minority. He abdicated in favor of his brother Mikhail. Of course, this was I will tell something about this. This was unconstitutional under the main laws of 1906 because the succession law was settled by 1825, and there was no precedent and no possibility for sitting Tsar to abdicate. You could do it, but you can enact, but under certain provisions, which of course were not held. Of course he could do it, he can create new law, but it didn't happen. All right, so and actually he could not abdicate, definitely he could abdicate for his son, and also anyway, Mikhail on the 3rd of March, Mikhail declined to take over the front, deferring the decision on the constitutional order to a future constituent assembly. So effectively transferring power to provisional government. So provisional government couldn't inherit any legitimacy over old regime or even old parliament. Firstly, old parliament was suspended, and of course, old parliament himself have legitimacy from the old order. Not to mention that, of course, the last Duma didn't have much legitimacy anyway. Peculiarly, Mikhail Act of Refusal sanctioned the transfer of legislative power from the government, from the old parliament to the provisional government, sort of disempowering the old legislative organ. This is actually not my analysis, this is analysis of Nabokov, which was himself part of Nabokov, who is the father of the famous writer Nabokov, who was the came from very distinguished legal family. His father was the Minister of Justice in Alexander III government. All right. So crucially, Tsar abdication was itself a break with the old order and sealed its fate. But however, provisional government did not claim the revolutionary legitimacy per se, but so its main objective in preparation of the democratically elected constitutional assembly. That should provide effective for a new basic norm. And so the norm which sort of it seems they were striving in the long run was the command of a constitutional assembly to be obeyed. But however, of course, there was some provisional basic norm, isn't it? The command of this committee which created the provisional government had to be obeyed, because the provisional government was created by this strange committee of the members of the former Duma. All right. All right. So what? Something else about this provisional government period. And why it's interesting? Because if you look on the Weimar, it was exactly what they look on this example as a kind of counter-example. The problem with provisional government was that, look, the elections in the Constituent Assembly already held in November after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the whole period was still in preparation for this great event of the summoning of Constitutional Assembly in August, long way where there was the pre-parliament. So it was, and in meanwhile, actually almost immediately due to dissolving of police force, there was the legal house. And of course, it was the state in the war. There was complete collapse of discipline in the army, collapse of the chain of the command, and in later time of the year, the mass desertion. There was an attempt of a military coup by the military in July, August, but it's failed by Kornilov мятеж. All right. So then you have Bolshevik Revolution, which happened on 25th of October. So the revolution itself was prepared by this Petrograd Revolutionary Committee, which actually was originally set to fight this Kornilov coup. This committee was formed by Petrograd Soviets. At this period, already Soviets were controlled by the Bolsheviks. All right, so here you have this revolution which was created, which effectively powered by this Petrograd Revolutionary Committee. So can you say that this was a new basic norm? Not at all, because they only claim power on behalf of the Petrograd Soviets. So more likely that new basic norm, and of course I will claim that it's exactly what was all Soviet norm until the very end. Was a decree Congress of Soviets over workers and soldiers deputies were to be obeyed. These decrees form the foundation of a new legal order. The first decree of this Congress, completely dominated by Bolsheviks, so became a tool of the Bolsheviks. Here we can see the difference with Weimar, where also was Soviet in November Revolution, also was this Congress, but it was not dominated by radical left. But actually in Weimar, the moderate socialists managed to have control. The situation was very different in Russia. So it was completely dominated by radical left. All right. So you have this Congress form of a government, Council of Soviet over People Commissars, and Western control over this government into the Congress and the Congress Central Executive Committee. All right, so you can see there is completely new structure. Interestingly enough, the first degree, they did not actually claim the abolition, the kind of disbanding the whole idea of constitutional assembly. They allowed actually for election to proceed. So actually the first decree of Congress providing for functioning over this government until the constitutional assembly. However, the fifth Congress declared all power transferred to the Soviets. Constitutional Assembly opened on the 5th of January. It was disappointed for the Bolsheviks. They actually only won 20, a bit less than quarter of the vote. The most of The most was won by socialists, but not the radical one. The Liberal Party only, I think they had less than 20%. So it was left, but it was not radically left. It failed to endorse the degree of declaration of the Congress, and they just shut it down on the morning, in early morning of 6th of January. Then the Central Executive Committee decreed, sort of post-dated, decreed dissolution of the Constitutional Assembly on 9th of January. On 18th of January, the Third Congress of Soviet voted in favor raising all reference to Constitutional Assembly for all new edition of the Soviet degree in laws. So here you clearly see, you have establishment of the new regime, which regime was based on the structure of the Soviet. So Soviet legal order, settling authentic Soviet identity, constitution of Russian Socialist Federation Republic, Soviet Federation, Soviet Republic of 1980 declared supreme power to be in Congress of the Soviet. Of course, the October Revolution led to a bloody civil war, which 10 million people were perished and 2 million were exiled. So it did not come at it didn't come at no cost, quite opposite. All right, so clearly that you have establishment over in particular, of course, after one of by 1921 to 1922. All right, in 1922, you already have formation of the Soviet Union. Again, on the same Soviet new foundation. So all Soviet Congress of workers, peasant, and soldier deputies by these firstly 4 republics. All right, so you have Second Congress approved the Constitution in the 1924. According to the Constitution, Congress of Soviet Deputies was the supreme organ of power. Central Executive Committee became supreme organ between Congresses. Central Executive Committee Presidium was the supreme executive, legislative, and supervising organ between sessions. And you still have this government of commissars. All right. Interestingly enough, while Constitution, already Stalin Constitution of 1936 didn't envision summon of the Congresses of Deputies anymore, it was enacted by the last all-Soviet Congress of Deputies. So we still have the same pedigree. What was interesting, Perestroika started with the reviving of this actual institution of the Congresses. Well, until the next revolutionary legal change in Russia in 12 December of 1991. All right, so clearly you have change not only basic norm, but you also have change of rule of recognition and rule of change. You also have change of rule of adjudication, because the degree, first degree, yet еще before Constitutional Assembly, abolished pre-revolutionary codes, created new local codes. With respect to law, these sort of primary rules, they continue to be enforced until abolished or against the socialist legal conscience. So a bit on this Nazi principles adjudication. However, already in the end of 1918, the degree on the People Code by the Central Executive Committee of this Congress directed judges to be guided Soviet degree and revolutionary legal conscience, and expressly prohibited reference to the former laws. All right, but after the victory in the civil war and settled down, you have by 1922, you have new system of code, but you also have new codes. Civil codes, new civil procedure codes, criminal code, new code of criminal procedure. So, all right, so here we can see the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, example, completely radical change. So radical change on the sort of unprecedented scale. And this is very interesting because we will see that in Germany situation was different. All right. So returning to this third point of a prerogative state, of course, revolution is done by prerogative state. In particular, in the period of a civil law, it was very clear. So you have establishment early on of revolution tribunals to fight counter-revolution and this jurisdiction over this sort of regime of threatening crime. They were a bit like courts, comparatively a bit like courts. But you also have establishment of infamous chicas. So the original function was preliminary investigation, but they became main means of terror because from the middle of 1918, already with coming of the civil war, they have power, not only power in consideration of the class amenities, but also power of execution. So clearly this was a tool of a prerogative power outside of normative state. So in distinction between revolution tribunals and Chika, revolution tribunals could call witnesses and decisions were made by civil tribunals, while the Chika decisions were based exclusively on investigations. By the end of the civil war, Chikas were dissolved and they continued, it became part of this state political department in the internal affairs ministry in KVD. So they have sort of dormant existing and sort of sprang back during the Great Terror. Constitution of Soviet Constitution, US Soviet Union Constitution actually did not mention revolution tribunal, so the history exists by this date. So now the last part on the Soviet law is the Great Terror. So the Great Terror. Under Stalin Constitution of 1936, which actually was drafted with participation of one of people who perished in the Great Terror, Bukharin, actually delimited the courts as a separate branch of the state power. Court did have some, but insignificant part in the Great Terror, said only 1%. Particularly their part was in conducting these public trials and famous public trials of 1936, 1937 against this well-known political figure, which was fabricated one. And this way interesting, of course, if you look on this Nazi trials, for example, against 1944, they were not fabricated, but these ones were fabricated ones. There was new wave of kind of this prerogative power growth was aftermath of assassination of Sergei Kiev, strongly suspected in public that it was by Stalin as a kind of eliminated of his political rival. He was the head of Leningrad Communist Party organization. Degree of a Central Executive Committee. Introduced speedy proceeding for terrorist acts and the infamous Article 58, which became the main means of a terror. But real terror started in 1937 after decree in the end of July, decree of NKVD, this Interior Ministry, on creating of local troikas attached to NKVD. These members considered of local official. So this became a main tool of terror. So what is the difference if we compare it with Red Terror difference? Look, it seems a bit better than Chika because Chika just have investigation in the firing squads. This you have between investigation by NKVD, which was tortures by attempted on confession with fabricated materials But still you have local troika, but they were just rubber stamping. But interesting that all people were charged. All people were charged by sort of under criminal law. So here you have almost some sort of fusion of a normative law and the prerogative, a normative state and prerogative state. By the way, Communist Party was not mentioned in any Soviet constitution until the last Soviet constitution in 1977. So it shows that Communist Party continued to be the main institution of a prerogative state and actually visible institution of prerogative state from the whole Soviet history. This period, 37 and 38, was terrific. Lowest estimate in 680,000 people, which were actually shot dead by the scoring, firing squad in this period. So it is unprecedented scale. It was rolled, Great Terror was rolled back by the end of 38. Trial by Troika was suspended. Interestingly enough, signed degree by the head of sort of government and Stalin and the secretary of the Communist Party. So you can see this in another example of a fusion of normative and prerogative. All right, I'm moving to the German Revolution of 1918. In some sense, very similar. So here you have collapse of empire during the First World War. On the 1st of October, they said that already by September was clear that that law was lost. So liberal Prince of Max of Baden became a chancellor, requested immediate armistice. On early November, they started, Navy revolt started spreading to major cities, including Berlin. Again, you have these soldiers invoke of deputy council as rising as the alternative seats of power. On 9 of November, situation was obviously out of control. So Baden announced abdication of Wilhelm Kaiser, but Kaiser only signed abdication decree on 20th of December, and also Crown Prince signed the decree. All right, so Baden not only resigned as the chancellor, but he appointed leader of the Social Democrats, Ebert, as his successor. Well, obviously this was unconstitutional. So you have collapse of the old regime. On 10 of December, the Congress of the Working Soldiers Deputies took place in Berlin. So you can see very similar. However, as I mentioned before, Congress was controlled, majority was by the moderate socialist. Congress set the government, the interim government, which is from Free Social Democrats and Free Independent Social Democrats, more left party. It was co-headed by Ebert. So Ebert not only was a chancellor, but he also headed this interior Soviet government. All right, so on the National Congress and the radical left proposal for council having legislative and executive power, as happened in the Soviet Union, became the basis of the constitution of a socialist republic was defeated. Instead, Congress opted to hold election, Constituent National Assembly, but basically the same Constituent Assembly as in Russian case on 19th of January. So you can see this lesson was learned. So you have very kind of quick succession of acts. So here you have a revolution in November, but you already have an election in January. Congress also call for socialization of industry, industry democratization, arming people, militia. But so what? All right, so here you have similar situation that you have in Russia. You have interim basic norm. It seems to be, but this interim basic norm in this case was the command of the Congress of the Council, but it's only for till the convocation of actual National Assembly. All right, so you have election of on to the National Assembly. Despite socialist expectations, they didn't have majority, but there was majority which was called the famous party, Catholic Center Party, Liberal German Democratic Party, and of course Social Democrats themselves. On 20th of January, draft of constitution were published. Prius was appointed to the Interior Ministry to draft constitution, I think in November. On 6th of February, National Assembly convoked in Weimar, so very quick. And of course, from this point of 6th of February, we have a new basic norm. So command of National Assembly are to be obeyed. So you have interim legislation enacted by National Assembly together with Committee of the State. Remember, Germany was a federal state. And the election of a president with power to appoint the government responsible to National Assembly. Ebert was the chancellor, head of Soviet, now became the first president. All right, so you have coalition on the 13th February, you have a coalitionary government of this Weimar coalition. On 31st of July, National Assembly enacted Weimar Constitution, which was signed by Ebert on 11 on August. So, so Weimar Republic was born. So what was Weimar Republic Constitution? Reichstag was the main seat of power, but they also have control of the government for the vote of no confidence. There was Article 76, which would be Article of Enabling Act in 1933, which give Reichstag power to amend constitution with, if they have quorum of 2/3, with 2/4 of this quorum. There was direct election, or not only Reichstag, but also president. There also was some other direct democracy provision for referenda and also the Constitutional Assembly, interesting by simple majority. But the ultimate power lay with president, who was sort of a seat of this kind of residual prerogative power too. He has power to appoint, remove chancellor, and dissolve parliament. But the most important power was under Article 48. He has emergency out, rule by degree, and use of the army in two situations. If states failed to carry duty, because it was federal state, to the federal constitution or law, or if more general clause, if public order and safety seriously disturb proceedings. There is a power of Reichstag to rescind the emergency degree. All right, so here we come to this crisis of 32. Why is this crisis important? Because you have a Kelsen paper, which expressed his view on this crisis. So, look, was for Great Depression, there was failure of Central Party, which Catholic Party in the Council Brüning, and because of his deflationary measures. So, due to this difficult political situation, actually, and Nazi became the second party since September 1930 elections. Papin became chancellor, who was representative of our right-wing party, became chancellor in June 19. No, he was a member of the Center Party, but sort of. All right. Hitler promised the parliamentary support condition on new election, lift the ban of on the Stormers and remove the Prussian state government, which was under control of Social Democrats. Hindenburg was the president at this time, issued the emergency decree under Article 48.1 and 2 concerning the restoration of public safety and order in the area of land of Prussia on 20 July 1932. Papin became federal commissioner for Prussia, removed from office Prussian prime minister and interior minister, both social democrat, and sort of not kind of remove, but strip them of any powers, all remaining ministers. Prussia applied for review of the decree on the 23rd July, but state court refused to grant immediate restraining order. The decree was declared anti-constitutional in part on 25th of October 1932, but by this time, of course, social democratic, it was a government from April of Prussia was demolished, and it was the major bulwark to the Nazis takeover. In Kelsen's view, the land of Prussia has turned by the measure to restore public security and order into a mere federal province administered directly by Reich, obviously in breach of Weimar federal constitution. All right, so what was Kelsen analysis of this judgment? With respect to the Article 1, which 38.1, which directed against the states, he has this kind of technical distinction. I use this recent 2015 translation. In this translation, is this sort of as a distinguish between judgment and the court judgment as such, and the court opinion justifying this judgment. Look, I don't know, can you have some analogy with this sort of the judgment, the decision and reason for decision? Only this second part, which he considered to be not part of a judgment proper of a court, actually mentioned that Prussia didn't violate any duty towards the Reich. So in his view, there was no any duty of the president to act with respect to judgment on court judgment on the Article 48.1. With respect to 48.2, court found the decree constitutional in parts or unconstitutional in parts. Kelsen's response was the decree cannot be divided in these constituent parts and open to different legal evaluation. So it seems it was not declared invalid and void. President was not under obligation to rescind his decree over 20th of July. So his general observation is, and of course it's to go back to this discussion with Schmidt on this guardian of a constitution, who should be guardian, should it be court? The president, of course, of Kelsen's draft of the Austrian constitution also thought that it should be court. But sadly, the Weimar constitution in Kelsen would created a very complicated federal system with finely balanced distribution of competence between Reich and lands, but it did not fit this system with effective guarantee for its own preservation. In particular, it did not create purposely constructed system of a constitutional adjudication. So there is no right of constitution general, and the Supreme Court can only take action in a very limited range of cases. All right. So since Article 48.2 itself provides no limitation on the scope of such interference, leaving it to implement statute, the organs that are called upon to apply Article 48 enjoy altogether unbounded discretion as long as implementing statute has not been enacted. In Duesenhouse interpretation, over this Kelsen position. President degree is valid until it is in fact nullified, and hence only voidable. So degrees continue to be valid until invalidated. So this is, I think it's actually show us almost, remember how he talked about this text of efficacy. It seems it shows some particular test. So in what point in time? So it seems basic norm would still continue until the unconstitutional measure, it was clearly in Kelsen view, this was an unconstitutional degree, until constitutional, this anti-constitutional measure can be just voidable, until, in my interpretation of it, there is some means, either by means of a court, or by means of Reichstag, or by means of a president himself, to actually to invalidate this unconstitutional statute. But I think it's important because if we go in 1942 and 1943, we can see that perhaps we can point this point in time when, in some point in time, there is no way to return. But of course, you can see this Article 48 was the article which creates this lagoon of prerogative power. Within the
Anna, sorry to interrupt you, but we have 15 minutes until the break if you want to take questions and answers.
All right. Yes, so I'm very quickly, I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry, you have 15 minutes, but it will depend if you want questions and answers. You know,
all right, I will try to go as quick as possible. So
no, don't rush it, please. Thank you.
Yes, all right. So takeover, Nazi takeover. On 17th of December, Reichstag amended Article 51, which actually relevant on Hitler. On the early termination of presidents, actually the head of the Supreme Court should become president till the election. All right, on 30th of January 1933, Hitler became chancellor, but conservatives have actually the majority. Hindenburg dissolved of parliament on to help Hitler to have majority in the new Reichstag. New elections were set on the 5th of March. On 4th of February, Hindenburg used Article 48 to issue degree of the protection of the German people, allowing ban opposition meeting and suppress publication dangerous to public security and order. This was still the March election. It was aimed at communists. So there was some era of terror already on the ground. But there was also Reichstag party on 27th of February. Next day, Hindenburg signed another degree under the same Article 48 for protection of the people and state. And this degree was in the memorable Frankel words was the constitutional charter of Nazi state, but it's constitutional charter of a prerogative Nazi state. Because what it's allowed for creation of this infamous mechanism of protective detention, basically concentration camp. By what means it's allowed for this mechanism? By removing legal remedies. By removing legal remedies. So it's it's suspended fundamental right and remove legal remedies with respect to violation of freedom, property, and all other things. All right. So can we say that this was a breach of the basic norm? I don't think so. If we look on this analysis of Kelsen 32, because you can have Reichstag who can rescind this degree. So it still was voidable in a sense. All right, they did very well. There was remarkable, of course, terror was unleashed. People would, you have this wild protection detention by the Sturmas SA. All right, so great intimidation, but Nazis did brilliantly. It was their, of course, best result ever. 44 and 5. Their coalitional partner have 8%, so they had the majority. However, they decided to have enabling act. Enabling act under 76, it's already have nothing to do with 48. You need to have a quorum on 2/3, and 2/3 of this quorum, they had it because of Central Party. Communists, of course, were not already were outlawed, even and were already in protected custody in the camp. Some of them already tortured, maybe killed. Also, some leading figures of Social Democrat joined them there. Still, 92, so 81 communists couldn't attend. From 120 Social Democrat, 94. All these Social Democrat voted against, but they were only ones. They were only ones. So they have 2/3 of minorities. They 2/3 of majority. So here you have this enabling act. So enabling act, main, it was innovation, was allowing, was basically became main seat of legislation. So they can have rules by degree. There was only free kind of free restriction. It should not affect position of Reichstag, Federal Council, President. All right. But by the way, all parties were dissolved on 13th of July. So there is no more parties. So Nazis became one party system. But moreover, in February next year, Reichsrat, the Federal Council, was actually abolished. Indirect breach of the enabling act. May I say that this was a breach of basic norm? Perhaps not. If we stretch so yes, I don't think this was. I must say that I don't think that enabling act was a breach of. Seems to be was unconstitutional. All right, but can you see that this abolishment of Reichsrat, Federal Council, was direct breach of enabling act? But however, you still have precedent. And he actually still continued to be commander-in-chief. And indeed, on the different pretext, on the Rome putsch, threatened to dismiss Hitler on 21st of June. So you can see the president continued to be last stumbling block to the creation of new normative order. He was terminally ill, so he died on the 2nd of August, but on the eve of his death, which was imminent, the Nazi government enacted the law concerning the state of German Reich on the 1st of August, on 34, which combined the offices of Chancellor and President and transferring the power of President to the Führer and Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler. So here you are. But not only they have this fusion, they actually have a plebiscite. They have plebiscite on 1904, and actually his degree on implementation law declare Hitler's conviction that all state authority must emanate from the people. The plebiscite was overwhelming, yes, 90%. The smallest result was 18 in former communist stronghold of Hamburg. All right. So this seems to be the point of no return on the death of the Hindenburg and elimination, this last opportunity that it could be still voidable. All right, so I take that the plebiscite, and plebiscite, of course, also beautifully set this new basic norm as a command of popularly endorsed Führer to be obeyed. All right, so what was the scope of revolutionary change? Look, it was also significant in the term of the secondary rules. So obviously Nazi government became main seat of legislation at expense of Reichstag. It was not abolished, but it's only actually was legislating the sort of organic law, renewing the enabling act 3 times, and also such yes, actually, in famous racial laws, Nuremberg racial laws of 1935. The court system was novel, but court system survived actually in Weimar time. It also was pre-Weimar time. This seems to be the most long-living German institution. All right, but it was taken, of course, under Nazi control already. Immediately after enabling act, you have the Civil Service Restoration Act, which cleans all politically undesirable people and the non-Aryan. On this early stage, they use this non-Aryan term, but then it became expressly anti-Jewish. All right, but also they use this. They have this, not only they have coordination, but also as a recent decade, again, there was this view developed against the Radbruch post-war view that it was legal positivism, which was at the root of Nazi evil. In fact, in the recent literature, you have this actually new insight on the adjudication very much in accord with principle, which actually was very obvious on respect of these racial laws. Racial laws did not, which, for example, one of the notorious was prohibiting sexual intercourse between Jews and Germans, but there was no distinction between actual position of party. However, Jewish co-descendants were treated very different. Look on the line, innocent German girl and morally deprived Juris. All right, so not
Anna,
only
we are breaking in 5 minutes.
All right, so not only special court were formed, but also you have this people's court. So you have the system of revolutionary tribunal, basically instated. So very serious distinction. But also you have a prerogative state. So you have a prerogative state, which I already mentioned, which created on the basis of this martial law. This degree on February 28 of 1933, which continued to be in force for the whole period. But of course, the main. So not only there was this political opponent, then they actually widened their group, this protective detention, to include these professional criminals, Yorkshire social people. So here you are, you have this kind of elimination of this national community enemy by means of this prerogative. Look, I probably finish here because, sorry, I went too long. Thank you so much. So perhaps we can have a few minutes for questions or something.
There, Anna, thank you very much. Spasiba, it's been very good, a pleasure. We have 4 minutes, and I'll explain to all, because we have many people from different countries, again, from Canberra and China. So we have to be conscious about the time. We will have a break. We'll stop the recording. However, what we're going to do, all that half hour, the break, still will be open. The Zoom will be open. So if people may have more questions or comments, or may simply have a chat used in the chat room with Anna or any other, please feel free to, because this session will carry on. Yeah, but we have to be conscious because some people will be with us all day. So, for the sake of simplicity and to keep all of us together. So before, we still have 3 minutes. Thank you, Anna, again. Interesting presentation. Do we have any comment or question? I have one myself, comment and question, but because I'm conscious of the time. Any other question or comment? Mikhail, I don't know if you want to say something, our next keynote speaker from Russia, or any other. If not, probably my comment / question to Anna. I know you talk about revolution. Of course, you talk about the German case and the Russian case. My question back to you, going back to Kelsen, I didn't see early in your presentation whether you established a similar reasoning, we had with Maris, an accurate concept of a revolution according to Kelsen. Are you thinking of the concept of revolution in a broad sense or in a Kelsenian sense? Why I'm saying this? Because for Kelsen, the revolution will happen only at constitutional level. It cannot happen at any other level. So it's a normative, logical concept. And then
yes, completely normative, because it's break of a basic norm.
But and then my question is, because again, if according to Kelsen, again, if we follow the procedure by the authority and according to the content of the precedent, the previous constitution, it wouldn't be a revolution, it would be an evolution, a legal evolution. So you are thinking in the same line. So it's not only because by force it's being reformed, but it's simply because it was a breach in law. That's why you talk about revolution in both cases.
Yes, of course there was revolution because there was the overturn of a previous basic norm.
Perfect. Okay, we are on the same page. Okay, we are on the same page.
Yes, exactly. Because the whole definition is the breach of a basic norm.
Perfect. Regardless whether it's been by force or not.
It's completely irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. This was his point. This was his point. Remember, I have this citation, which only have in state of law of this, which is irrelevant if it was done by mass of people or the people in government positions.
Very clear distinction. I saw the kind of same guiding principle between Mari's presentation and your presentation, Anna, because you clearly distinguish the factual from the logical or normative, which doesn't mean, as Mari said before, they coexist. And I think your presentation clearly shows, that they coexist, the normative and the factual. Thank you very much. It was.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much for your comments. Yes.
I know we are running out of time, but any other question or comment for Anna before I stop the recording? You can keep on then the chat later, but no. Well, spasiba, Anna. Thank you very much. And Gonzalo, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So Anna and the rest, what we had to do, because we were going to have active breaks with videos and interview and so on. We felt it was too heavy for all of us, especially people like Anna or Jingsu or Wei, from China, Canberra. It would have been a very long day, very tiring day. So what we decided to do, we will have a regular break with music. So we leave this on. I'll stop the recording. So in fact, I'm going to stop the recording now.